Black pillars on the right have determined that now, just right now, is the time to give up. And, well, I do not understand that, even a little bit, because, yeah, there's a lot of problems going on right now, whether it be Hunter Biden corruption, COVID tyranny, or school propaganda. There's been a lot of things that have been going on that are pretty bad, and on top of that, you also have things like, well, elections, which I bring up for no reason in particular. However, that is not an excuse to give up, particularly when these problems aren't new. These problems have existed for quite a long time. Just to take elections as an example, 1960, that was an election that was suspicious, and same with 1872. There have been many stolen elections throughout time, one's more or less proven. Black pillars have now decided that this is the time to give up, that everything has been tried, there is nothing more that the right could possibly do, and that the right will simply lose the battle no matter what we do. Which I cannot understand even a little bit. I mean, I see this as exactly the opposite situation. Yeah, there's a lot of problems going on right now, whether it be Hunter Biden corruption, COVID tyranny, or commie propaganda in schools. There is a lot going on right now, and a lot of problems have occurred and have even intensified over the past few years, particularly the last year and a half. But that's not an excuse to give up. It's not even really a reason to even think of giving up, particularly since these aren't new problems. These problems have been going on for quite a long time. The most prominent of which, I would say, is medical tyranny. Because this pandemic, which has been going on for a year and a half and isn't even really a pandemic at this point, considering that it is now an endemic disease, is not the first pandemic that has been responded to with mask mandates and other similar procedures. The 1918 Spanish flu was met with a very similar response, led basically entirely by doctors who were professionally wrong, and the outcome is, well, shaping up to be quite similar to how it is now, because whether it be down to the mask mandates, or it be to the people who have been shot for not following these dictates by people who are supposed to be upholding these dictates, which has happened just a week or two ago, and happened during the Spanish flu, very similar instances. It's actually kind of remarkable how similar these things are. These things seem to be at least partially in parallel with each other. But don't get me sideways. I'm not saying that these problems have existed forever, always will exist, and could never be beat. That itself would be a black pill argument. What I'm saying is that these problems did not begin here, but rather they are on their way out here. They are ending here. Because as opposed to the 1918 Spanish flu, which did end and had a lot of the restrictions pushed back, this time, rather than simply going after particular instances, you're going after the entire establishment deep state apparatus, which is causing it in the first place. And the most prominent example of this, at least I think, would have to be Dr. Anthony Fauci, because though he is professionally wrong today, he did not get that job 2 years ago. He has been professionally wrong for, 30 or 40 years. Just look at what he said about the AIDS pandemic and how potentially there could be indoor community spread among families. And compare that to what he's saying about the potential monster variant of COVID now. It's strikingly similar. In fact, sort of hauntingly similar, exactly how he does it. And he uses the exact same condescending tone that he's been using for the past year and a half with regard to COVID-19. He's the same dude he's been for 40 years, but now we're pretending that he just came into existence a little more than a year and a half ago. And this is something that is quite encouraging, because back during the AIDS pandemic, no one was calling for Fauci's job, or at least not enough people. Nowadays, there's an entire side of the political spectrum that is after his head, figuratively of course, but are after his head in the firing sense. And the next time a Republican gets elected, which should be very soon, might I add, he's out. He's not going to be in there anymore. In fact, a lot of that medical establishment apparatus, particularly if we don't depend on a singular person to solve all the problems, will likely be at least partially dismantled in the process. This is a very good thing, and something that applies to many of the other problems that we've been having. Most prominently of which, I believe, to the commie propaganda, which has been proliferating throughout schools, not just for the past few years, but for decades. Because these sorts of things have been going on since the 50s and 60s. And at that time, it was done so well that no one even noticed. And those who did notice were slandered, saying that they were simply going after their political opponents and that they had no evidence to their claims. To the point where many people, even on the right, still continue to believe that propaganda nonsense about people like the House Un-American Activities Committee or Joe McCarthy, who were proved resoundingly right in the intervening decades as the Soviet archives were opened up, and guess what? Everything they said was true. Compare that to today, where now, instead of parents being almost completely out of touch with what was going on in schools, with the active communist propaganda proliferating and such, there is now completely active protests going on at almost every school board in the country where it gets discovered that something of this sort is happening, in which, of course, there is a lot, considering that the corruption is so deep. The point being here is that these problems did not come out of thin air. These problems did not suddenly poof into existence in 2019 or in 2016. These problems have been there for literally decades, and unlike the decades where no one noticed what was going on, now people are. And, of course, some people are going to attribute this to the internet, and I think that's at least a contributing factor to such. But I don't think that fully explains the phenomenon. I think it is simply that this movement has run out of steam and has, more importantly, become much less subtle in the intervening years, which some see as an example of them winning so hard, but I personally see as a complete rejection of them. I see it as a last dying breath of a, dying political strategy. Rather than the subtlety and the deftness with which they manipulated the culture in the past, now you're seeing a very blunt and frankly ineffective hand. Now, when you're talking about 30 years ago, the conservatives could hardly get in a propagandistic word when it comes to the language. The left was completely dominant in that respect. Nowadays, it seems as though every other week there's a new right-wing term that is not only incredibly effective, but is actually very meaningful, whether it be CRT, wokeness, or any of the other terms which have been come up in the past few years. Cancel culture is another good example of exactly what has been going on with the right, because rather than these things not existing, it's more accurate to say that the right didn't have the language to describe the things that were going on in the past. And this is the major difference between now and then. It's not that these problems are worse. In fact, they're quite a bit better nowadays. We're in a quite better state than we were 30 years ago. It's just that you started noticing with the advent of things like wokeness, or the idea of cancel culture, and that sort of thing. Those things were still going on, don't get me, completely in decades past. It's just that there is no words to describe them from the right, which has changed the battlefield drastically, and completely destroys the Black Pills argument when you actually look into it. But of course, to the Black Pillars, this is utterly immaterial. They don't care about this sort of thing, because otherwise, how else could they convince you to give up? And that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. If you enjoyed that video, do in fact subscribe down below, and check me out on other platforms, particularly new tech platforms, because I'm on BitChute, I'm on Rumble, I'm on Odyssey, I'm on Brighteon, and I'm also on Minds and Gab for if you like some text posts. And that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. I'm KelKidman, this has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.